Hello, everybody. Welcome to another video. Today it is the 3rd of February. In today's upload, we're going to look at some really interesting updates from parts of the front line that I seldom discuss, especially over the past month or two. And so today we're looking at, first of all, the battles in Andriivka on the Dnipro and Pokrovsk fronts, respectively, also at Chasiv Yar, and then we'll look at Verkhnokamianske and the Zherebets river front. And that's an area in particular that I've not mentioned much, and so I will be looking at recent Russian movements in that location. So stay tuned for that by the end of the video. But we are beginning with Andriivka, and as we do so, please like and subscribe to grow the channel. Now, over here, you can see that I've marked in yellow Russian advances amounting to 50 hectares, largely in houses in the eastern part of the town near the Orlova River. There are no longer any solid Ukrainian positions north of this river, and the Russian forces, they are assumed to be in control of or are in the process of clearing out any other holdings that are sort of to the east of the populated regions. So that would include some pretty large forested patches that you can see marked on the map over here with this gray zone at the moment. We just don't have visual evidence yet of the Russians within this 2 square kilometer area, but it also includes a lot of large scale Ukrainian fortifications spanning all the way southwards to the floodplain. So the Ukrainians, they're now coalescing around a settlement defense, fighting from street to street, not necessarily sending in infantry groups to repel the Russians from individual houses, from individual blocks, more so deploying their FPV crews to strike those advancing Russian soldiers, which can only do so much when the volume of Russian advances and attacks in this one concentrated area is pretty high right now, as it is within this like 20 kilometer front line region, the most important part of the Russian attack vectors. And so this is where they're concentrating the most efforts besides the current battles unfolding in Dakhnia, which are also of heightened importance. But as you zoom in over here, you'll see that the Russian side, largely the 114th Motor Rifle Brigade, but there are a couple of other units scattered in this realm, including the 1454th Territorial Motorized Rifle Brigade. 239th Tank Regiment is also generally floating around here. The garrison that was involved in the Krakove capture, they're either right now in an operational rest because they were involved in like 2 or 3 months worth of high intensity fighting in an urban area, or they're continuing with operations pushing westwards into Dakhnia or further southwards. So you have garrisons that are active around here from the 242nd Motor Regiment, which was not really involved in Krakove. Same thing with 255th. It was not at the center stage, and now it's being seen more and more. And then you have the 33rd Motor Rifle Regiment and 102nd. 102nd as well recently moved in, and it's sort of taken over the mantle as one of the main Russian units involved, pushes over here. The units that were involved in the capture of Western Krakov, especially, they're also generally around here, but I can't really say that they're the main elements involved in the current clashes in Dakhnia. It's sort of a mix of all the units that I mentioned before. And so right now, the Russian forces are in the process of taking over really piecemeal fashion, individual roads, individual houses. And the Ukrainians, they are dragging out the fighting over here because they understand that losing control of this populated area would make it virtually impossible in the coming weeks to hold on to the, say, 6 kilometer wide pocket that currently connects Ulakli to Dakhnia. And so by extension, the Russians that are all currently focused on Dakhnia, which is sort of disconnected from the clashes in Andriivka, they would be able to move westwards and put some significant pressure onto the Ukrainian garrison that is currently resisting in that populated region, not just in Andriivka, but also in Konstantinopil and Ulakli. And so right now, the Ukrainians, they are trying to fortify the center of the town because at this point, due to the local geography, including the elevation, given the fact that the Russians are advancing from really high elevated areas west of Slovyanka and Petropavlivka compared to where the Ukrainians would be resisting in between floodplains like the Vavcha and Orlova rivers, it just makes it extremely unlikely that they would be able to hold on to the eastern part of Andriivka. And so a lot of resources are now poured into the center. But the center, as you can see, it's not that large in terms of square kilometers. A lot of the roads leading into it, whether it be this highway that's just sort of parallel to the Vavcha River, they are located on a really, really low elevation. And then you look at some of the other roads, they're pretty close to the front line, like ones passing through Konstantinopil or Lockley. And so, from a logistics perspective, it's not dire, but the Russians have the ability to hamper the movement of Ukrainians back and forth and also just fire directly towards the Ukrainians organizing the center. And there just aren't that many houses in this area in contrast to Krakow, which, by the way, is sort of similar in size. Krakow is probably larger, but it's way more dense and did offer a lot of cover when it came to apartment buildings and concrete slabs, basements, and all that. Andriivka really doesn't have that. You don't really see duplexes around here. It's really just private residential areas, and so it is a difficult area to sort of turn into a main hub of defense. And really, when you look at other candidates for that sort of mantle to pick up once Andriivka does end up falling, Bakhatir doesn't really fit that. Kamar is probably the closest option, and that's located really far away from where the current theater of operations is, further eastwards around the current Dakhne pocket, as I referred to it. But it is important to note that now the 46th Air Assault Brigade, they are involved in defending in Andriivka. So I don't know if it's just that certain battalions were moved over here, or that the entirety of the unit is now focused on defensive efforts over here, because there still remains a certain Ukrainian garrison deployed to Dakhnia. So I don't know if the 46th is still doing that. Now, looking a bit to the north in Srebrenica, this is also important because the Ukrainians are offering up extremely fierce resistance in every single village that is located in this sort of hinterland region between the line of contact and the border between Dnipro and Donetsk. And they are small in size, these villages, and the Russian garrisons also aren't that large in a lot of these locations. They completely lack armored vehicles. I almost never see them in footage posted from the Ukrainian side when the Russians are advancing through these areas. It's almost always on foot. But nonetheless, the Russians have been able to capture another 2 square kilometers, advancing past Novoandrivka and entering into the southern parts of Srebrenica. The northern section still remains under Ukrainian control, and they're still able to access Srebrenica, the Ukrainians, through a direct horizontal road connecting the hamlet Zaporizhia to it. And so it sort of just follows that if the Russians are able to capture Srebrenica in its entirety, that they'll have access to roads that take over the nearby hamlet as well. And then from there, they would reach Preobrazhenka, and that's really the final village in this cluster of settlements. If you look at the elevation, generally the higher elevated regions looks like this. It's really spanning the Russian line of contact, but then also the chain of villages where the Ukrainians are currently resisting. And so that's why the Russians are advancing over here in the first place, not just for the settlement, but also for the heights. And it overlooks certain lower elevated areas, either along the Vavch River Valley or a bit to the north. And what I'm referring to is this lower valley region starting in like Novoolonivka and spanning northwestwards, and sort of connecting with the Solona River Valley to the north over here, which is also pretty much on the administrative boundary with Dnipro. And that crosses through Nadivka, where there currently are heavy clashes. So again, the Ukrainians over here, they are very active. A lot of units deployed over here, they are from the 150th series. And so you can imagine that's extremely difficult for Ukrainian soldiers to enter into a high intensity area that, again, is pretty small. So there isn't that much luxury in the sort of being settled in operating in some of these areas. And there's also a huge reliance on having acumen when it comes to drone resources, because if a position gets overran, then it becomes face-to-face fighting. So the drones are certainly the last line of defense. You don't have a lot of trenches around here, and not a lot of like important natural barriers. You do have tree lines, but they're not really that built up in this location. That's why the Ukrainians are trying to compensate for that by building up on the border, and also now around Novopavlivka, Mezhova. I do need to update the trench map and give you guys just an explanation for what the Ukrainians have done over the past couple of months. So I'll do that this week. But in any case, you do have Ukrainian garrison that is pretty new over here, that doesn't have as much experience from brigades 151, 153. You see them over here on the map. But you also have a National Guard units. And then further north, you also have some higher caliber Ukrainian elements like the 59th Assault Brigade. And they have put up a really significant fight and have been able to repel Russian assaults directly into Uspanivka, which is so small in area, but nonetheless, the Ukrainians have been able to hold out, and that's due to efforts of infantry. And so that's due to being willing to take the risk of higher attrition in order to hold on to those areas. But it has sort of put a halt to the Russian momentum that was pretty close to reaching the border with Dnipro. Same thing with Udachnia. Deep State is reporting that there was a rotation, so some of the new Ukrainian units from 155th Brigade, they were rotated out, were replaced by an unnamed brigade or unnamed unit that already has some sort of experience on the front line. And so they apparently have had some pretty good results on the front line over the past week of clashes. Now, they didn't mention it because they claim deep state that the Russians don't have a good idea of the order of battle, which I don't believe that to be the case. I think it's pretty clear right now what the order of battle is over here to anybody, even to myself. And you know that based on Ukrainian Telegram channels reporting and posting footage that gets geolocated to these areas. So it's not much of a secret. But you have previously the 32nd Brigade also operating around here. But for the past month, I haven't really heard much from them in this location. Like they were very, very active in like Novovasilivka, Solone, Vovkove. But since then, it appears that they suffered pretty high losses in terms of manpower, and were not maybe not fully rotated out, but at least the infantry corps was moved out, and only the umbrella drone unit is still deployed and engages in heavy fighting. So right now, the units that you see most engaged in Udachnia include the Skala Assault Regiment, which maybe is the unnamed units, but you also have the 42nd Mechanized Brigade, previously deployed from Toretsk and now moved to Udachnia. They've been fighting around here pretty heavily. And you also have the 3rd Spartan National Guard Brigade, previously operated around the Vovchansk region and really played a huge role in repelling Russian assaults towards Lipsy and then conducting their own counterattacks. So it seems like a perfect fit for this location, especially given the fact that the Vovchansk front is one of Ukraine's lowest on the pecking order. So this is an area where these 2,000 men are really, really needed. But nonetheless, the Russians have been able to advance deeper into Kotlina, capturing 2.8 square kilometers or 0.8 square kilometers, advancing largely along the windbreaks over here. And the Nova unit, they conducted FPV strikes onto those Russian advancements. So that's important to note. But again, it's all within the general perimeter of Kotlina. And this is an area where you do have the 155th Brigade still operating. Now, looking a bit to the east, you have over here this Russian advance west of Baranivka, amounting to 0.7 square kilometers of territory. And I've adjusted the front line to indicate that the Ukrainians still have physical control over the entirety of the highway that connects Semyonov and Pokrovsk, because there's just not enough elaboration on the Russians holding on to the ring road. But they do still retain control over some of the warehouses that are just a couple hundred meters to the south. So definitely keep this in mind for the future. And now the Russians are focusing on advancing across a broader front line, not just across one road. So it's definitely not the end of that clash, those series of engagements, I should say. Now, over here to the north, they have the Russian forces in the Chasiv Yar region advancing deeper. This was recorded on January 31st. A video by the Dodo units of the 5th Assault Brigade. Previously, I said that it was deployed, that brigade, to Pokrovsk, but it's probably split. So certain elements are there. Maybe only the drone units remain in the Chasiv Yar region, or maybe some battalions, infantry battalions, are still over here as well. But definitely, they are now playing a role in trying to hold back at least the Russian attacks that are occurring south of Chasiv Yar. In the process, the Russians have been able to capture 1 square kilometer of territory. This was on January 31st. They dropped grenades, the Dodo units, onto Russian soldiers that were in these dugouts or craters within the quarry facilities. And now the Russians are really, really close to reaching populated areas like Mykolaievka that are no longer in higher elevated regions. So the Russians have almost completely taken over the high ground that is located to the west of the Donbass Canal in a lot of these locations. And now you're reaching an area that's on lower elevation, whereas really the Russians have a huge elevation advantage in this case. You can see that the Ukrainians, they're at least they're going to have positions that are in hardened areas like houses and basements, but they're going to be completely overlooked. Really good Russian vantage points all across this hilly region, this rugged region with the quarries and all the slag heaps and such. So now it's going to be used by the Russians to project power and firepower, to be exact. Now to move northwards, I want to look at Verkhnoukamyansk and more generally the Siversk front. I don't want to go out there on a limb and say that the Russians are significantly expanding offensive activity over here, but in relation to the past couple of months, because there was a period of time, I would say, in like the later, maybe like 2/3 of the way through 2024, where the Russians did increase the intensity around the southern part of the Siversk front, but since then it's really died down over like the past 3 to 4 months. Now we're seeing a bit of an uptick in Russian activity, including with armored assaults, which is something you don't see in every single part of the front line. But in this region, it sort of is understandable because a lot of the villages are more sparsely populated and more spread out. So it is a pretty good idea to use armored vehicles to dismount forces in deeper attacks where the Ukrainians are more spread out in more thinly manning positions. And so that sort of fits the framework for what's been happening around Verkhovno-Kamyansk, because there was an armored assault that was able to land forces in the eastern part of said village. And then over here on February 3rd, there was a video from the K2 drone unit of the 54th Mechanized Brigade where they hit Russian vehicles. They hit like four of them that had just the complete build of a turtle tank, going at very slow paces, making them really, really obvious targets for Ukrainian drone crews that are pretty experienced around here. But at this point, I think that the Russian soldiers operating it, they sort of understand that they may get hit, but they're hoping that the armor will be able to absorb it, that all the additional enhancements won't lead to the destruction of the vehicle. And then there's also the option of dismounting, and that's what happens a lot of the time. And Russian soldiers were geolocated dismounting and capturing 0.8 square kilometers, taking over some of these abandoned houses and forested patches. And then to the north over here, just south of Bilohorivka, the Russians captured another 1 square kilometer of territory, also entering into some of these forested patches and crossing over the border from Luhansk into Donetsk. The issue is now the Russian forces are beginning to advance along higher elevated regions that overlook the defensive nodes of the Ukrainians, leading up to actually the eastern perimeter of Siversk. So over here you have, I guess, a general sketch of the high ground where the Ukrainians are defending. And the Russians now, due to these captures that are squiggling in the southeastern corner, they're beginning to chip away at a lot of those possessions. And that includes being able to flank Bilohorivka and overlook the northern parts of Bilohorivka, and also includes overlooking eastern Bryanka and Hrihorivka, and then also being able to flank and overlook Verkhovno-Kamyansk, which then leads directly into Siversk, which is also located on pretty low elevation. So it's absolutely incumbent upon the Ukrainians to retain control over this large swath of open fields and forested patches. But then again, that has to be done by preventing Russian armored breakthroughs in those locations, which is something they've been able to do in the past. But now you could see that the Russians have been able to make some progress for the first time in a while. So it'll be important to see whether the Russians have more success. And the best way to judge that would be whether they're able to achieve more advances within a populated area like Verkhovno-Kamyansk. And then from there, the pressure directly on Siversk would become even more significant. Now, here's an interesting thing you could see over here on what was this? There's a geolocation that I wanted to mention. On February 2nd, you had the 2nd Artillery Brigade of the Russian Armed Forces. They used a fiber optic FPV to strike a Ukrainian mine bridge. So the Ukrainians, they put these really significant high-yield explosives on a pillar that was holding up a rail bridge that extends out of Siversk to the east. So, of course, it's a rail bridge. It's not being used for rail, but I'm sure that you could see some movement of light vehicles and just movement on foot across this region. And so the Ukrainians had mines on those pillars, and for whatever reason, they put them up before the Russians were able to even get close to it, because the Russians right now, they're about, let's see, 5.5 kilometers away. So it's not like it's anything urgent at this point, but the Russian side, they noticed this and they struck it, of course, and thereby destroyed a huge part of the bridge span that moves around this region. The actual rail tracks weren't fully destroyed, but it doesn't really matter because the actual span holding up the rail tracks was just totaled by it in the area where the explosion occurred. So that was just interesting to note, and I have the geolocation on my map. Now to finish off, you can see over here in the Zherebets River fronts, Russian forces advancing deeper across this western bridgehead, capturing nearly 4 square kilometers of territory, including getting more positions north of Bilohorivka. So this will be an important objective for the Russian side to capture. And then also Kolodiazi. This is important because it's one of the final villages in the Russian purview before they're able to just solidify control over a large set of open fields that are on hilly elevation. That also includes a lot of trenches that were built to defend against these sort of Russian attacks. So this is an important village and would give the Russians further impetus to expand their bridgehead even deeper, and then actually begin to have positions that overlook some of the rail, some of the road infrastructure, and some of the key sort of nodes on the rear, like Drobysheve, if you remember from 2 years ago. And from there, the focus would not be to go further westwards to the rear. It would more so be to shift focus southwards on Zarichny and Toretsk, and to fully eliminate the Zherebets pockets that currently the Ukrainians are operating within. But first, we have to see the Russians advance deeper. And for now, the Ukrainians are trying to repel it. Here you could see on February 2nd, a Russian soldier, he was hit by a grenade. This was shown by the Ukrainian side and geolocated, and this helped us indicate that the Russians were able to expand their control a maximum of 3.5 kilometers westwards. And in addition, the Russian forces were able to advance ever so slightly west of Makivka. This is another one of those bridgeheads, but one that has much less resources poured into it at the moment. But you continue to see the Russians just gaining control over heights that are located slightly to the east of Kharkivka. But here you actually have a difference because there is a more solid line of geographic defenses like ditches and trenches. And then also there's a pretty solid amount of units deployed in this region. But that's all I have for today. So thank you all so much for watching. I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.